Dr. Nielsen-Gammon is a Regents Professor at Texas A&M and is the Texas State Climatologist. How cool is that? We have Texas's own climatologist with us in the room today. He received his BS in Earth and Planetary Sciences in '84, and then also a PhD in meteorology, all at MIT. And then Dr. Nielsen-Gammon joined the faculty of A&M in 1991 and was appointed. You have now served as the Texas State Climatologist since 2000 and was an appointee of George W. Bush when he was then governor. Dr. Nielsen-Gammon conducts research on large-scale and local-scale weather, climate, and air pollution, and teaches courses in weather analysis and forecasting, and is also a fellow with the American Meteorological Society. It's an honor to have you here today. Thank you very much. Let's give it up for our first speaker.
Well, thank you for that introduction. It's actually pretty rare that someone gets to the end of the introduction and pronounces meteorological correctly, so I'm very impressed. So I'm going to give you a little bit of science. I'm going to share some research that I did over the fall and presented at the American Geophysical Union conference back in December, focusing on Motivated by Harvey, which those of you outside of Houston may not have heard of. And I imagine if you're talking to people about climate change, the subject of extreme weather such as Harvey perhaps comes up quite a bit. And so it's useful to know at least what the current state of the science says about this sort of thing. So Harvey in historical context. For the purposes of understanding things like dam safety, nuclear power plant resilience, and that sort of thing, engineering firms utilize analyses of rainfall amounts over a given area, over a given duration, to understand how big a flood could possibly occur. You certainly don't want a dam failing on you, so you design dams basically to be resilient to anything that could plausibly happen. So I took analyses of the biggest rainfall events basically in United States history, going back to before the year 1900, as long as we have data for it to analyze the rainfall amounts. And it doesn't matter where they occurred, although most of them happened in the southern United States or the southeast United States, and looked at the average amount of rainfall over that entire area. Here I'm showing you 10,000 square mile areas. Some of the top of it on this list before Harvey was a flood on the Brazos River in 1899 that was quite devastating. Hurricane Beulah hit South Texas in 1967. Those of you from Louisiana remember the flooding just a year and a half ago there, which actually makes the top 10 list fairly comfortably. So here on that same scale is Harvey. Devastated the record, didn't just simply break the record. 50% more rainfall over a broad area than any previous storm we know about in United States history. So it was not simply unusual for Houston, it was unusual for the entire United States by a large margin. Now, of course, I'm showing you the most dramatic example here. You can always cherry pick a particular metric, pick a day, period of time, pick an area, and find something unusual about that storm. So let's look at a broader subset and see if Harvey comes out on top. Yeah, it comes out on top. Doesn't matter what duration you use. There's one storm back in 1940 that nobody remembers, that small area, smaller time makes the list, but Harvey takes the cake over all areas. And you're probably more familiar, at least in the news, with rainfall gauge totals. Rainfall particular point is fun for record keeping. It doesn't cause a flood if it just happens in one location. But Harvey also now holds the record for greatest storm total rainfall in the continental United States, with over 60 inches in a couple places near Beaumont. More rain over a 3-day period than anywhere in the United States, including Hawaii. So One of the things that made this storm especially unusual was the hurricane stalled, and so the rainfall kept occurring over roughly the same place day after day. And so here's a stall, if you haven't seen one before. And actually, we're going to use this as our hurricane metaphor. If you imagine a storm getting trapped inside a corral and not being able to move much, you can. The smaller the corral, the more the impact is going to be concentrated. So we'll use the size of the corral, metaphorically speaking, as a measure of how much the storm stalled. The smaller the corral, the bigger the stall, so to speak. And admittedly, I could make more puns about stalls and corrals than I have already. This is what Harvey's stall looked like. Unfortunately, the color got shifted over. Move that a little bit, and it stalled over Victoria, Texas, basically. The size of the area that stalled in is about 123 kilometers, so a little less than a 100-mile radius, so really confined to a fairly small area. So that is actually rather unusual. Only 3% of all named tropical storms in the historical record ever stalled that much in their entire lifetime. Here's where they stalled. Really all over the place. There's a few along the coast, but there's not a preference for storms to stall along the coast. The colors represent different seasons. I'm not going to go into details of that. But to focus on storms like Harvey, I pulled out all of the events that stalled close to the coast and had a relatively small corral size, so to speak. And here they are. Unfortunately, all of the slides have my annotation shifted from the grid. But there were a total of 4 storms that stalled as slow as Harvey over an area as small as Harvey, with an intensity of wind circulation as large as Harvey. And one of them is Harvey, which was one of the 2 costliest storms on record behind Katrina. The 2 of the other 3 are on the top 5 list of deadliest Atlantic hurricanes ever in the entire record of hurricanes going back to the 1700s. Hurricane Mitch killed roughly 11,000 people in Honduras back in 1998. Flora killed about 7,000 people in Cuba and Dominican Republic back in Haiti in 1963. So these storms are particularly consequential in terms of impact. They're also consequential in terms of the amount of rainfall they produce. I've got totals here in millimeters. Harvey is the one that's sitting in the middle there. 1.5 meters of rainfall, as I mentioned. This is Flora, produced 2.5 meters of rainfall. In imperial units, that's over 100 inches of rain in a single location. And other state records, Georgia, Alabama, and Florida, which are among the wettest records in the United States, are also associated with stalling tropical storms, which all seem to produce fairly substantial amounts of rainfall. So this is an important phenomenon to look at. Now, there's been one study so far that's looked at how likely it is that rainfall produced by a stalled storm would occur in the present climate and in the future climate. This is actually a former advisor of mine, Kerry Emanuel's work. The storm total rainfall is along this line, and again, all the annotations are shifted. So actually, Harvey came in at about 800 millimeters over an area the size of Harris County. And the return period for such a thing, based upon model simulations, which you have to take with a grain of salt because it's just one model, it's one way of estimating these things. Return period for something like that happening is about 1 in 500 years, with a large uncertainty. But looking at it at the end of the current century, return rate goes from 1 in 5,000 years down to about 1 in 500 years. So that this is saying storms like Harvey, while they're always going to be rare, are becoming dramatically more likely to occur in a warming climate. So I've looked at the historical record for this sort of thing, and in terms of all of the storms that have ever stalled close to the coast, you get this sort of graph going back from the late 1800s to the early 2000s. And there's a lot more that have stalled recently compared to the past in the data record. Of course, the data record's not perfect. The farther back you go, the less accurately the storms are tracked. And in fact, it turns out that if you look at the storms that stall, most of them have an average wind speed of less than 50 knots or so. That's the red bars. And in terms of where the trend is happening, most of the increase we've seen in the past century in the blue bars has been on those very weak storms, the ones that we can't necessarily track very well. In fact, went back and looked at the storm that Harvey's record broke, the 1999 flood in Brazos River in Texas, and that particular storm persisted as a weak low center that stalled over south central Texas, but the hurricane database dropped it once it made landfall. So, as with most aspects of trends in extreme weather, we've got model estimates, which aren't completely reliable, but they're a bit of evidence. We have historical trends that aren't completely reliable either because of the quality of the data, but they're also providing evidence. And both of these are pointing to an indication that storms like Harvey at least will be more common in the future. In the breakout session I'm participating in just before lunch, I'll go into more detail about how we, as scientists, specifically address the issue of whether a particular storm is caused by climate change or affected by climate change or probability changed because of global warming. And I'll look at the studies that have come out on Harvey specifically to see what we can confidently say about it now and talk about some of the work I'm doing to try to improve that confidence scientifically so we can be more concrete about what the risks are that we're facing. So to summarize here, stalling hurricanes, if they happen near a coastline, are a big deal. They can maintain their intensity, they're constantly pumping water onto land, and can cause very catastrophic floods. We've seen more storms stall along the coast in recent years, although mostly those were the weak ones that we probably weren't keeping track of in the past. Harvey itself was unprecedented for the United States. There's never been a storm of its intensity stalling for so long in one place, but it's not unprecedented for the Atlantic Basin. We've seen storms over Cuba and over Central America that have done that same sort of thing, generally with devastating results. As far as the climate change impact, really the clearest impact on climate change with a storm like this is rainfall. If you have a warmer atmosphere, you've got greater amounts of water vapor being ingested into the storm and consequently greater amounts of rain being produced. Lastly, my question at the bottom, do you have any rainfall data for me? Actually have a National Science Foundation funded project to produce the best possible analysis of Harvey's rainfall, not just for its own sake, but to provide the best input into the hydrologic models to simulate urban flooding so that we can more accurately estimate the risk of flooding throughout Houston or any other metropolitan area in which those models might be applied. So you can go to the Office of the State Climatologist website and find a couple of links, a place where you can input your data and tell us about your observations, and we love to include them in the analysis because no data is perfect, but it's all useful. So thank you very much.
Another